The storm came without warning that night, and Marcus Chun sat alone in his cabin, listening to the thunder shake the walls around him. Had lived in this remote part of Montana for 2 years now, far from the city and far from the memories of his failed marriage that still haunted him sometimes when the nights grew too quiet. Marcus was a wildlife veterinarian by trade, a man who had always found it easier to connect with wounded animals than with other people. His ex-wife Sarah had told him once that he cared too much about broken things and not enough about the people standing right in front of him. Maybe she had been right, he thought, as lightning flashed across the sky and illuminated the dark forest outside his window. That was when he heard it, a sound unlike anything he had ever encountered in all his years working with animals. It was a shriek that cut through the howling wind, filled with pain and fear and something else that made the hair on his arms stand up. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and rain jacket without thinking, because that was who he was, the kind of man who ran towards suffering instead of away from it. Rain hit him like a wall of ice as he stepped outside, and the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. He followed the sound deeper into the forest, his boots sinking into mud with every step. The flashlight beam caught movement ahead, and Marcus froze when he saw the creature lying in the wet leaves beneath a fallen tree. It was about the size of a fox, but that was where any similarity to earthly animals ended completely. The creature had scales that shimmered with colors he could not name, shifting between purple and blue and silver as the lightning flashed overhead. 3 pairs of eyes, 6 eyes in total, stared up at him with an intelligence that made his breath catch in his throat. One of its wing-like appendages was torn badly, and silver fluid leaked from the wound onto the forest floor. The creature hissed at him when he took a step closer, baring teeth that looked sharp enough to cut through bone. Marcus had dealt with frightened animals his whole life, and he knew that fear made even the gentlest creatures dangerous. He crouched down slowly and began to speak in the soft voice he used with injured wolves and wounded eagles. "Hey there, little one," he said gently, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. "I know you are scared and hurting, but I'm not going to hurt you." The creature watched him with all 6 of its eyes, and he could swear he saw something like confusion in that alien gaze. He kept talking, telling it about his cabin and the warm fire, and how he had medicine that could help with the pain. Minutes passed as the rain soaked through his jacket and the cold seeped into his bones. Finally, slowly, the creature stopped hissing and let out a sound that was almost like a whimper. Marcus took off his jacket and wrapped it around the strange being as carefully as he could manage it, flinched when he touched it, but did not bite him, and he lifted it into his arms like a wounded child. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it should have, but Marcus kept talking the whole way. He told the creature about the deer he had saved last winter and the owl that still visited his porch sometimes. When he finally pushed through his cabin door, he laid the creature on the table near the fireplace and got to work. His veterinary training had not prepared him for alien biology, but wounds were wounds and blood was blood. Even if this blood was silver, he cleaned the torn wing carefully and stitched it closed with steady hands while the creature watched him with those strange eyes. He gave it water from a bowl and it drank eagerly, and he wrapped it in warm blankets. By the fire, hours passed as Marcus sat beside the creature, monitoring its breathing and changing its bandages when the furnituring its breathing and changing its bandages when the silver blood soaked through. He talked to it through the long night because silence felt wrong somehow. He told it about growing up in Seattle and about how his father had taught him to fish in streams just like the ones near this cabin. He talked about Sarah and how she had left him for a man who worked normal hours and came home at normal times. The creature listened. He was sure of it, with an attention that felt almost human as dawn broke through the windows. The creature's breathing had steadied, and its eyes had closed in sleep. Marcus decided to call her Nova, because of the way her markings glowed softly in the darkness like distant stars. He did not know what she was or where she had come from, but none of that mattered right now. What mattered was that she was hurt and alone, and he could help her far above the earth, hidden behind the dark side of the moon. A massive starship hung in the void of space. High Commander Vorath stood on the bridge with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the blue planet below. The Valorian Empire had been searching for Princess Elendra for 3 days now, ever since the assassination attempt had forced her escape pod off course. She was the only heir to the throne, and her disappearance had thrown the Imperial court into chaos. Vorath allowed himself a small smile that none of his officers could see from their stations. The assassination attempt had been his doing. Of course, a carefully planned strike that should have ended with the prince's dead and himself as regent, but she had escaped, using the ancient bloodline ability to transform into the sacred bonded form of their people. Now, she was somewhere on this primitive world, wounded and alone among creatures that the Empire classified as barely sentient. Find her, Vorath commanded, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Search every corner of that planet if you must. He needed her found, preferably dead, but alive would work too if he could control the situation properly. The princess had always been too soft, too concerned with mercy and kindness and other weaknesses that had no place in Imperial rule. Back in the cabin, Nova opened her eyes and watched the human sleep in the chair beside her. His hand rested near her body, not holding her down or trapping her, just present and warm and somehow comforting in her 200 years of life. Princess Elendra had never known anyone who gave without expecting something in return. Advisors wanted influence and suitors wanted power and allies wanted trade agreements and military support. But this human had walked into a storm and risked his life for a creature he knew nothing about. He had stayed awake through the night just to make sure she kept breathing. He asked for nothing because he expected nothing, because kindness was simply who he was. Elendra did not understand it, but she felt something shift inside her chest as she watched him sleep. It was small and warm and frightening in a way that assassination attempts had never been. She closed her eyes again and let herself rest, knowing somehow that she was safe here. The storm had passed, and morning light filled the small cabin with gold outside. The forest dripped with rain and smelled of pine and wet earth, and in the space between a wounded princess and a lonely veterinarian, something had begun to grow. 2 weeks had passed since the night of the storm, and Nova had healed faster than Marcus thought possible. Her torn wing had mended completely, leaving only a faint silver line where the wound had been. She could fly now if she wanted to. He had seen her testing her wings in the living room when she thought he was not watching, but she showed no interest in leaving. And Marcus found that he did not want her to go either. His days fell into a new rhythm that felt more natural than anything had in years. He would wake up to find Nova curled at the foot of his bed, her scales catching the morning light. They would eat breakfast together, him with his coffee and eggs, her with whatever meat he had prepared for her. She had refused the dry cat food he tried on the first day with a look of such offense that he had laughed out loud. Now she ate venison and rabbit and fish, and she seemed to enjoy watching him cook almost as much as she enjoyed eating. Marcus talked to her constantly because the silence of the cabin had always been too heavy. Before he told her about his work at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in town, about the animals he saved and the ones he lost. Nova listened with those 6 bright eyes, tilting her head in ways that made him certain she understood every word. Sometimes she would make soft sounds in response, chirps and trills and low hums that felt like conversation. One morning, Marcus was reading a veterinary journal at the kitchen table when Nova jumped up beside him. She looked at the pages with obvious interest. And when he turned to a new section, she made a sound of protest. He laughed and turned back. And she settled down to stare at the diagrams of animal anatomy with focused attention. "You are the strangest creature I have ever met," he told her, scratching behind what he assumed were her ears. "And I have met some very strange creatures in my time." Nova leaned into his touch and made a sound like purring. And something in Marcus's chest felt warm. He had not felt this kind of companionship since before the divorce. Maybe not even then. Sarah had always been busy with her own life, her own career, her own friends who did not understand why she had married a man who spent more time with animals than people. But Nova was always there, always present, always seemingly happy just to be near him on the nights when the loneliness crept in despite her company. Marcus found himself talking about things he had never told anyone. He sat by the fire with Nova in his lap and told her about the day his father died. He talked about holding his mother's hand at the funeral and promising to take care of her. A promise he had kept until cancer took her 2-3 years later. He confessed that sometimes he felt like he was better at saving animals than connecting with humans. "Maybe that is why Sarah left," he said quietly, stroking Nova's scales as the fire crackled. "Maybe I was always more comfortable with creatures who could not talk back." Nova made a soft sound and pressed her head against his chest, right over his heart. In that moment, Marcus could have sworn she was trying to comfort him. Princess Alindra had lived for over 2 centuries, and she had thought she understood what loneliness meant. She had been wrong. She realized as she listened to Marcus pour out his heart in the firelight, loneliness was not being alone in a crowded palace surrounded by servants and advisors and guards. Loneliness was what Marcus carried inside him, a deep ache for connection that he had never been able to fill. She wanted to tell him that he was not broken, that his capacity for caring was not a weakness, but a gift among her own people. Such open emotion would be seen as shameful and primitive. Of Valorians prided themselves on logic and control and the suppression of feelings that served no practical purpose. But watching Marcus cry quietly while holding her, Alindra felt something crack inside the walls she had built around her own heart. She had been raised to be a princess first and a person second, always calculating, always performing, always aware of how her actions would be perceived. No one had ever held her like this, like she mattered simply because she existed, not because of her title or her power. Marcus did not know he was holding royalty, and that was precisely why his kindness meant so much. He would have done the same for any wounded creature, and somehow that made it more precious, not less. The days continued to pass, and Alindra found herself dreading the moment when she would have to reveal the truth. Her wounds had healed, and she could transform back to a true form whenever she chose, but doing so would mean leaving this strange pocket of peace she had found in a cabin in the woods. It would mean watching Marcus's face change when he realized what she was, watching him become formal and distant the way everyone did when they learned she was a princess. She was not ready to lose this, whatever this was. One afternoon, Marcus came home from work with blood on his shirt and a tired look in his eyes. "Lost one today," he said quietly, sitting down heavily on the couch. "A young deer. Hit by a car on the highway." Nova jumped up beside him and pressed against his side, and he wrapped an arm around her automatically. "I know it is part of the job," he continued, his voice rough. "I know I cannot save them all, but it never gets easier." He talked about the deer for a while, about how it had looked at him with trusting eyes while he tried to save it. Alindra listened and ached for him, for this man who carried the weight of every life he could not save. Her own advisors would have called such sentiment weakness, but she was beginning to think they were wrong about many things. Later that week, Marcus was chopping wood behind the cabin when the axe slipped and cut deep into his forearm. He cursed loudly and dropped the tool. Blood flowing freely from the gash. Nova came running from the cabin, making sounds of distress that were almost like screaming. She circled around him frantically as he pressed his other hand against the wound. "It is okay," he said through gritted teeth. "It looks worse than it is. I just need to get inside and clean it up." But Nova was not calming down. And as Marcus watched through the haze of pain, something impossible happened. Her form flickered like a candle in the wind. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, he saw something else. It was tall and humanoid, with silver hair and pale skin and those same 6 eyes staring at him with desperate concern. Then it was gone, and Nova was just Nova again. A strange alien creature pressing against his legs and whimpering. Marcus blinked hard and shook his head. Deciding that blood loss must be making him see things, he stumbled inside and stitched up his own wound with hands that shook only a little. Nova stayed pressed against him the whole time, her eyes never leaving his face that night. Marcus lay in bed and stared at the ceiling while Nova slept curled against his side. He told himself that what he had seen was impossible, that his mind had played tricks on him. But some part of him, the part that had always trusted his instincts with animals, knew that was not true. There was something more to Nova, something she was hiding, something that both thrilled and terrified him. He decided that he did not care. Not really, because whatever she was his friend, and Marcus Chun had learned long ago that true friends were rarer than any treasure in the universe. Far away in the cold void of space, High Commander Vorath received a report that made his jaw tighten. The covert team he had sent to retrieve the princess had finally located her signal on the primitive world below she was alive, which was unfortunate but manageable. He gave the order for the retrieval team to move in, with specific instructions about what should happen to any witnesses. The princess would be found and brought back, and whoever had been harboring her would be eliminated. No one could know that she had spent weeks living among primitives, like some common refugee. Vorath smiled coldly as he watched his soldiers prepare for deployment soon. This embarrassing chapter would be closed, and he could return to the business of taking the throne for himself. He did not know about the bond forming in a small cabin in Montana. He did not understand what human kindness could do to a heart that had never known it, and that ignorance would be his greatest mistake. Something was wrong, and Marcus could feel it in his bones even before he saw the first sign. It started with the lights, strange flashes in the night sky that moved too fast and too deliberately to be planes or satellites. His electronics began acting strangely, the television flickering and his phone losing signal at random times. Nova had become agitated over the past 2 days, pacing around the cabin and staring out the windows with her 6 eyes wide and alert. She would not eat, and she barely slept, and every sound from outside made her flinch. "What is it, girl?" Marcus asked her, kneeling down to meet her gaze. "What has got you so spooked?" Nova made a sound he had never heard before, a low, urgent keening that sent chills down his spine. He checked his rifle and made sure it was loaded, though he could not have said what he was preparing for that night. Marcus sat in the dark with Nova pressed against his legs, watching the tree line through the window. The moon was full and bright, casting silver shadows across the clearing around his cabin. At first he thought the movement was a trick of the light, shapes shifting between the trees in ways that did not match the wind. Then he saw them clearly, 4 figures in armor that seemed to bend the light around them, making them almost invisible. They moved with military precision, surrounding the cabin from all sides. Marcus felt his heart begin to pound. But fear had never made him freeze. It had always made him fight. He grabbed his hunting knife from the table, since the rifle was across the room and there was no time. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Nova, positioning himself between her and the door. The door exploded inward, Torn off its hinges by a force Marcus could not see, 4 soldiers stepped through the opening. Their armor fully visible now, sleek and silver, and covered in symbols he did not recognize. They were tall, taller than any human, and they carried weapons that hummed with strange energy. The one in front spoke in a language Marcus did not understand, but the meaning was clear from the way he pointed at Nova. They had come for her, and they would kill anyone who stood in their way. "No," Marcus said, his voice steady even as his hands trembled around the knife. "You are not taking her." The lead soldier tilted his head, and Marcus heard what might have been a laugh from behind the helmet one spoke. And this time, Marcus understood the words. They must have activated some kind of translator. "Stand aside." "Primitive," the soldier said, his voice cold and mechanical. "The creature you harbor belongs to the Valorian Empire, and you have no right to interfere. She is hurt and scared, and she has done nothing wrong," Marcus replied, not moving an inch. "I do not care who you are or where you come from. You are not taking her." The soldiers exchanged glances. Clearly confused by his defiance, they had expected a primitive to cower, to beg, to run away in the face of superior force. Instead, this human stood before them with nothing but a knife, ready to die for an animal he had known for only a few weeks. "Your species is even more foolish than the report suggested," the leader said, raising his weapon. "Step aside or die with the creature." Marcus tightened his grip on the knife and prepared for the end. He had always known he would die for something he believed in. He had just thought it would be an animal he was trying to save. Well, Nova was an animal as far as he knew, and saving her was exactly what he intended to do. The leader's finger moved toward what must have been a trigger, and Marcus braced himself for pain that never came. Instead, there was a sound like shattering crystal, and the cabin filled with blinding silver light. Marcus stumbled backward, shielding his eyes, and when he could see again, Nova was gone. In her place stood a being of impossible beauty, 7 feet tall, with flowing silver hair and pale skin that seemed to glow from within. She had 6 eyes, just like Nova, but now they blazed with a fury that made the air itself feel charged. Her body was draped in what looked like living light, and when she spoke, her voice resonated with power that made the windows rattle. "You dare raise weapons against the heir to the Valorian throne?" she demanded, and the soldiers immediately dropped to their knees. "Princess Alendra," the leader stammered, his arrogance completely gone. "We were sent to rescue you. We did not know." "Silence," Alendra commanded, and her voice cut through his excuses like a blade. "I know exactly who sent you and why." She stepped forward, and the soldiers scrambled backward, despite their weapons and their armor. "High Commander Vorath ordered this mission, did he not?" she asked, and it was not really a question. "Tell me the truth. What were your orders regarding witnesses?" The leader hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "You were ordered to kill this man," Alendra said slowly, her voice dropping to something dangerous and cold. "My uncle sent you to eliminate a witness and bring me back, preferably dead from my injuries." One of the other soldiers spoke up, his voice shaking with fear. "Princess, we were told you were being held captive by hostile forces." "We did not know." "Did not know what?" Alendra interrupted. "Did not know that my uncle tried to have me assassinated? Did not know that I crashed on this planet fleeing his killers? Did not know that this human," she gestured at Marcus, "saved my life and asked for nothing in return?" Marcus stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. His Nova was a princess, an alien princess from some empire that spanned the stars. She was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, and powerful in a way that made him feel like an ant before a giant. But when she turned to look at him, her 6 eyes softened, and he saw the same creature who had pressed against him during thunderstorms. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was gentle now. "I am sorry I deceived you." "You," he started, then stopped. not knowing what to say. You were hurt, and I helped you. That is all, Alindra smiled, and it was the saddest, most beautiful thing he had ever seen. No, she said softly. It was so much more than that, and I think you know it. She turned back to the soldiers, her expression hardening once more. Contact your ship, she commanded. Tell them Princess Alindra is alive and well, and that she demands to speak with the Imperial Council immediately. The soldiers obeyed without hesitation, their fear of her clearly greater than their fear of Varath while they worked their communication devices. Alindra returned to Marcus's side. My people have a concept called Virkith, she explained quietly. It is a life debt, a bond that transcends all other obligations. She reached out and took his hand, and her skin was warm despite its pale glow. But what I feel for you is something more than duty or debt, she continued. You showed me kindness without knowing my value. You protected me without knowing my power. You cared for me because caring is simply who you are. Marcus looked down at their joined hands and then up at her alien face. I do not understand any of this, he admitted. I am just a veterinarian from Montana who found a hurt creature in the woods. And that, Alindra said, is exactly why you matter more than you know. The soldiers interrupted with news that more ships were entering Earth's atmosphere. Earth himself was coming. They reported, with a full battle group to rescue the Princess. Alindra's jaw tightened, and Marcus saw the princess give way to the ruler she had been trained to be. Then we will meet him together, she declared. And I will show my people what true strength looks like. She looked at Marcus, and there was a question in her eyes. I will not force you to stand with me, she said. This is not your fight. And my uncle is dangerous beyond anything you have faced. Marcus thought about her words, about the easy path of stepping aside and letting alien politics sort themselves out. Then he thought about Nova, curled against his chest during thunderstorms. About the way she had listened to his stories without judgment. He thought about Sarah saying he cared too much about broken things. Maybe he did, but he would not apologize for it anymore. Where you go, I go, he said simply. That is what friends do. Alindra stared at him for a long moment, and then she laughed, a bright, surprise sound that seemed to fill the broken cabin with light. You humans are full of surprises, she said, squeezing his hand. Perhaps that is why I find you so fascinating. Outside, the first ships began to descend through the clouds, and the night sky filled with lights that were not stars. The battle for Earth and for the soul of an empire was about to begin. High Commander Vorath descended from his shuttle with the confidence of a man who had already won his battle group. Hung in orbit above the planet, enough firepower to turn this primitive world to ash if he chose. Behind him came 50 of his best soldiers, their armor gleaming in the morning light. Earth's governments had detected the ships, of course, and panic was spreading across the planet like wildfire. But Vorath did not care about the primitives and their fear. They were beneath his concern. He cared only about the princess standing before him in the clearing outside a pathetic wooden structure. Niece, he said, his voice smooth as poison. How relieved I am to see you alive and well. Alindra stood her ground, her silver hair flowing in the breeze, her 6 eyes fixed on his face. Uncle, she replied, her tone equally cold. How interesting that you came yourself to rescue me. I could not trust such an important task to others, Vorath said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false humility. Not after your unfortunate accident. You mean the assassination attempt you orchestrated? Alindra asked, and her voice carried across the clearing to every soldier present. Vorath's smile did not waver, but his eyes grew hard and dangerous. What a terrible accusation to make against your own family, he said. You must still be suffering from the trauma of your ordeal. He gestured at Marcus, who stood beside the princess in his simple human clothes, looking small and fragile among aliens. And who is this creature? Vorath asked, letting contempt drip from every word. Surely you have not grown attached to one of these primitives. This man saved my life, Alendra declared. He found me wounded and alone, and he nursed me back to health without knowing who I was or what I was worth. How touching, Vorath said. And his soldiers laughed at the signal from their commander. A primitive playing nursemaid to royalty. What has our empire come to? Alendra's eyes flashed with anger, but she controlled herself with visible effort. I invoke the Tribunal of Truth, she announced. And her voice rang out like a bell. The laughter stopped immediately, and Vorath's smile finally cracked. You cannot be serious, he said, his composure slipping for the first time. That right has not been used in 1,000 years. The ancient laws still stand, Alendra replied. Any accusation of betrayal against the crown may be judged by the tribunal, and the accused must submit or forfeit all standing in the empire. Vorath's jaw tightened, and Marcus could see calculations running behind those cold eyes. If he refused the tribunal, he would be admitting guilt in the eyes of the imperial court. If he accepted, he would have to face judgment before witnesses who could not be bribed or threatened. Very well, Vorath said finally, his smile returning. I have nothing to hide, and I welcome the chance to clear my name. Within hours, the clearing had been transformed into a makeshift courtships landed with nobles from across the empire. Summoned by ancient protocol that not even Vorath could ignore, a great circle was formed, with Vorath standing at the center and Alendra facing him across the divide. Holographic screens projected the proceedings to the imperial court back home, where millions watched. Marcus stood beside Alendra, feeling completely out of place among these tall, beautiful, powerful beings. He had put on the cleanest shirt he owned, which still had a small stain on the collar. Several nobles looked at him with open disgust, whispering to each other about the primitive the princess had brought. Alendra began the proceedings by laying out her accusation in clear, precise terms. She described the attack on her convoy, the deaths of her guards, the desperate escape that had brought her to Earth. She presented evidence from the soldiers who had been sent to retrieve her, their orders, their communications, their instructions regarding witnesses. Vorath countered with smooth denials and alternative explanations. He was good, Marcus had to admit. He twisted words like a snake and made accusations sound like confused misunderstandings. Nobles listened and murmured among themselves, clearly divided in their opinions. Then came the moment that would change everything. Tribunal required a champion of character, someone to speak to the truth of the accused nature. Traditionally, this was a Valorian noble, someone of standing who could testify to the character of the parties involved. I name Marcus Chen as my champion, Alendra announced, and the clearing erupted in shocked protests. This is outrageous, Vorath shouted, genuine anger finally breaking through his mask. A primitive cannot serve as champion. He is barely more than an animal. The ancient laws specify a champion of character, Alendra replied calmly. They do not specify species, the nobles argued furiously. But scholars consulted the texts and found that Alendra was correct. There was no requirement that the champion be Valorian. The founders had never imagined a need for such a rule. Marcus was escorted to the center of the circle, feeling every alien eye upon him. Vorath looked at him with contempt so pure it was almost beautiful in its intensity. Speak, primitive, one of the judges commanded. What do you know of High Commander Vorath's character? Marcus took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Thought about all the times he had testified in court about animal abuse cases, about speaking for creatures who could not speak for themselves. This was not so different. Really, I do not know your laws, Marcus began, his voice quiet but steady. I do not understand your politics or your history or your ancient ways. He looked at Vorath, then at the assembled nobles, then at Alendra. But I know what I saw when your soldiers came to my home," he continued. "I saw men who were willing to kill me for the crime of showing kindness to a stranger." The clearing had grown completely silent in my world. "We judge people by how they treat those who cannot help them," Marcus said. "The measure of a person is not how they act toward the powerful, but how they act toward the weak." He turned to face the nobles directly, meeting their alien eyes without flinching. "I found your princess wounded and alone in my forest," he told them. "I did not know she was a princess. I thought she was simply a hurt creature who needed help. And you helped her anyway?" One of the nobles asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. "Of course," Marcus replied, as if any other answer was impossible. "She was suffering, and I could ease that suffering. What else would I do?" A murmur ran through the crowd, and Marcus pressed on. "I have a question for all of you," he said. "When was the last time any of you helped someone who could not help you back? When did you last show kindness to someone beneath your station, expecting nothing in return?" The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Marcus looked at Varth, who was watching him with barely concealed hatred. "This man ordered my death because I was inconvenient," Marcus said simply. "He tried to kill his own niece for power, and he would have destroyed my entire world to cover his tracks." He paused and shook his head sadly. "Where I come from, we have a word for people like that. We call them monsters." Varth exploded with rage, stepping forward with his fists clenched. "You dare lecture me, you worthless primitive?" he shouted. "Your species is nothing, less than nothing. You crawl in the dirt while we stride among the stars." He was losing control, and everyone could see it. "When I am emperor, I will wipe your pathetic planet from existence," Varth continued, his voice rising to a scream. "Your kind does not deserve to breathe the same air as Valorians." The clearing went deathly quiet. Marcus stood very still, but inside he felt a strange calm. He had done it. He had made the monster show its true face. One of the judges stepped forward, her expression grave. "High Commander Voreth," she said formally, "you have just threatened genocide against a sentient species, which is forbidden by the most ancient laws of the Galactic Concordance." Voreth's face went pale as he realized what he had done. I was provoked," he stammered. "The primitive manipulated me. Sentient beings are protected under our laws, regardless of their technological development." Another judge interrupted. "Your threat has been recorded and transmitted across the Empire." Guards moved forward to surround Voreth, who looked around wildly for support that was not coming. "This is not over," he hissed at Marcus as they led him away. "I will destroy you and everyone you love." Marcus just looked at him with sad eyes. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a tired sorrow for what fear and pride could do to a Salulindra. Came to stand beside him as Voreth was escorted onto a prison transport. "You did it," she said softly, wonder in her voice. "You showed them what they had forgotten." "What did I show them?" Marcus asked. Genuinely confused, Alandra smiled and took his hand. "That power without compassion is not strength," she said. "It is only cruelty waiting to happen around them." Nobles were talking and hushed. Urgent voices. Something had shifted in the air. Not just the outcome of a trial, but the beginning of something larger. A primitive human had spoken truth to power, and the stars would never be quite the same. The weeks that followed the tribunal were a blur of activity, and Change of Earth was taken back to the homeworld in chains, where he would face the full judgment of the Imperial Court. His conspiracy had been deeper than anyone realized, with dozens of nobles and officers involved in his plot. The Empire was shaken to its core, and everyone looked to Princess Alindra to restore order and faith. She had proven herself stronger than anyone expected, and the people loved her for it. But before she could claim her throne, there were matters on Earth that needed attention. Marcus stood in his cabin, which had been repaired by Valorian technology, that still made his head spin. Door that had been blasted off its hinges was back in place, looking better than it had before alien engineers had even fixed his leaky roof. Though he had not asked them, Alindra stood at the window, looking out at the forest she had come to love during her time here. She was wearing human clothes now, a simple sweater and jeans that Marcus had bought in town. She looked beautiful in them, he thought, though he supposed she would look beautiful in anything. The council expects me to return within 3 days, Alindra said without turning around. There is so much work to be done, reforms to implement, wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. You will be a good empress, Marcus said. And he meant it with all his heart. She turned to face him, and her 6 eyes were filled with emotions he could not quite read. Come with me, she said. And it was not a command but a plea. Be my consort, my advisor, my partner in all things. Marcus felt his heart squeeze painfully in his chest. He had thought about this moment, dreaming about it during the long nights, since the tribunal part of him wanted to say yes, wanted to follow her into the stars and see wonders beyond imagination. But a larger part of him knew that path would lead nowhere good. I cannot, he said softly, and the words hurt to speak. I am sorry, Alindra, but I cannot. She stared at him, and he saw pain flash across her face before she controlled it. Is it because of what I am? She asked. Because I deceived you? No, Marcus said quickly, stepping forward to take her hands. Never think that. What you are is wonderful and amazing, and I am honored to know you. He squeezed her hands and forced himself to continue. But I am a veterinarian from Montana who likes quiet mornings and long walks in the forest, he explained. I am not suited for courts and politics and the fate of empires. He smiled sadly and shook his head. If I came with you, I would be miserable, he admitted, and eventually you would come to resent me for it. And I could not bear that. Alindra was silent for a long moment, and Marcus feared he had broken something precious. Then she laughed, a surprised, delighted sound that made his heart soar. You are refusing an empire because you prefer trees and animals, she said. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Is that wrong? Marcus asked, confused by her reaction. It is exactly right, Alindra said, her eyes shining. Do you understand? Everyone else would have leaped at power. Advisors, nobles, suitors, everyone. She cupped his face in her hands, her touch warm and electric. You chose authenticity over ambition, she said softly. And that is why I love you, Marcus Chen. The word hit him like a thunderbolt, and he could not breathe for several seconds. You love me? He managed to ask. I have loved you since the night you stayed awake to watch me breathe, Alindra replied. I just did not have the words for it then. She kissed him, and it was strange and wonderful, and unlike anything Marcus had experienced before. When they finally parted, both of them were breathing hard. I have a proposal, Alindra said, her voice slightly unsteady. Since you will not come to me, I will come to you. Marcus blinked in confusion. But the Empire, he started. The Empire has survived for 10,000 years without me, Alindra interrupted. It can survive a few days at a time while I visit a certain human who saved my life. She explained her plan with growing enthusiasm. Earth would be granted protected status under her personal seal, meaning no species could interfere with humanity's development. This was unprecedented. Primitives were usually left to evolve on their own without any special consideration. But Marcus would be named Ambassador at Large, a position with no real duties except one. He would be her anchor, her refuge, a reminder of why compassion mattered more than power, and whenever her duties allowed, she would return to him and this small cabin in the woods. You would do that? Marcus asked, hardly daring to believe it. Come all this way just to see me? I would cross 1,000 galaxies to see you, Alindra said simply. Did you think love would be stopped by a little distance? Marcus laughed and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I think I love you too," he whispered into her silver hair. "Strange alien princes and all." "Good," Alindra murmured against his chest. "Because you are stuck with me now, Marcus-chan." 1 year later, everything had changed, and nothing had changed. Marcus still lived in his cabin, still worked at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, still took long walks in the forest, but now there were photographs on his mantle that would have seemed impossible before. Pictures of him standing beside alien dignitaries, of shaking hands with creatures from distant stars, a formal portrait of Empress Alindra I in her coronation robes, inscribed with words in the language he was slowly learning to read. Earth had changed too. Though most people did not notice the difference, day-to-day humanity now knew they were not alone in the universe. And the knowledge had both frightened and inspired them. Some had panicked, but most had adapted with the resilience that seemed to be humanity's greatest gift. Protected status meant no invasions or interference, but cultural exchange was permitted and even encouraged. Human scientists now worked alongside Viloran scholars, and the possibilities seemed endless. But for Marcus, the most important change was much simpler. It was a winter evening, and he was reading by the fire when a familiar glow appeared at his window. He smiled and stood, walking to the door he always left unlocked. Now a small creature with iridescent scales slipped through the opening. Fox-sized, with 6 bright eyes and markings that glowed like stars, Nova jumped into his arms and made the purring sound he loved so much. Then she transformed, and Empress Alindra stood before him in a simple dress, looking tired and beautiful. "Hard week?" Marcus asked, wrapping his arms around her. "You have no idea," she sighed, leaning into his embrace. "3 trade disputes, a rebellion on the Outer Rim, and my Minister of Finance keeps asking when I am going to produce an heir." She pulled back and grinned at him. "I told him I was working on it." Marcus felt his face grow hot, which made Alindra laugh in delight. They spent the next few days in perfect peace. He showed her the family of foxes he had been treating, and she told him about the reforms she was implementing across the empire. She helped him repair a fence, and he taught her how to make pancakes from scratch. They argued about whether dogs or Valorian soul cats made better companions, a debate neither of them would ever win on. The last night before she had to return, they sat together on his porch, watching the stars. Alindra pointed out her homeworld, a distant speck he would never have noticed before. Marcus told her about the owl family that had nested in his barn, and about old Mrs. Henderson, who had finally adopted the 3-legged dog. Small things, real things, the fabric of a life lived with purpose and love. "My advisors still do not understand why I keep returning to this primitive world," Alindra said softly. "And what do you tell them?" Marcus asked. "That they will never understand," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "And that is precisely the point." Marcus kissed the top of her head and held her closer. He thought about everything that had changed since that stormy night, when he had found a wounded creature in his forest. He had saved a life and gained a universe, but more importantly, he had learned something about himself. Sarah had been wrong. Caring too much about broken things was not a weakness. It was the very best part of being human across the galaxy. Beings with technology beyond imagination continued their ancient games of power and conquest. They mapped stars, conquered worlds, and shaped the fate of trillions, but on a small, insignificant planet at the edge of known space. A human and an empress watched the night sky in comfortable silence. They were proof that sometimes the greatest power in the universe is not found in warships or ancient bloodlines. Sometimes it is found in a warm blanket, a bowl of soup, and someone willing to stay awake through the long night beside you. Marcus smiled and squeezed Alindra's hand. Stars twinkled above them like a billion tiny promises, and somewhere in the forest, an owl called out to its mate in the darkness. All was well. All was exactly as it should be, and that, perhaps, was the most extraordinary miracle of all.